The first scream shattered the night like glass, slicing through the thick humidity of South Carolina in 1837. Hidden beneath the rafters of an abandoned tobacco barn, a young slave girl, no older than 8, pressed her small face against the rough planks, trembling as the shadow of her master loomed over the figure of her mother, sprawled on the dirt-stained floor. The words that would haunt her for the rest of her life tumbled out before she could stop them. "Master killed my mama in the barn." Every syllable hung in the heavy air, each one a forbidden confession of cruelty that would have been lethal if overheard by anyone else. Tonight, we peel back the layers of a truth that generations tried to bury, one that exposes not just brutality, but the calculated coldness of power exercised over innocent lives. Before we go deeper into what Ruby witnessed in that barn, I need you to do something. Hit the subscribe button now, and leave a comment telling me the city or state where you're listening from. Your participation isn't just a number. It locks you into the truth we're about to uncover. And if you feel the weight of this moment, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this secret within you. This is no ordinary story. This is a journey into the hidden mechanisms of control, where even children learn their place in the machinery of oppression. Magnolia Ridge Plantation, set deep in the rolling fields outside Charleston, was outwardly ordinary. Its whitewashed manor gleamed under the southern sun, its Greek columns a symbol of respectability, but beneath its doors and across its 350 acres a darker rhythm prevailed. The young girl, Ruby Drummond, had grown accustomed to the patterns of labor, the overseer's barked orders, the quiet resignation of her mother Patience. But no one had prepared her for the night that would fracture everything she understood about loyalty, justice, and survival. The barn was not just a workspace. It was a theater for secrets, a container for sins long ignored. That evening, lamplight flickered over tools, hay, and the scattered remnants of a life that had been measured in obedience and silence. The air reeked of sweat, earth, and the faint metallic tang of something else, something that would mark Ruby's childhood forever. She crouched in the shadows, gripping the planks, feeling the tremor of her own heart as her eyes fixed on her mother, bruised and beaten, and on the man who should have protected her, standing silently, watching it unfold. Type, "The veil is broken," twice, and comment your location. Your eyes are now witnesses. Your mind is now part of the story. Ruby's small body pressed closer to the barn wall, each heartbeat hammering against her chest like a warning she could not ignore. Outside, the cicadas chorus had turned sinister, a relentless backdrop to the violence within. Patience Drummond's labored breathing, ragged and uneven, punctuated the silence between blows. Her mother had always been careful, meticulous, trying to bend to the will of those who owned her life. But that evening, care and caution meant nothing. Each strike of Dutch Calloway's fist, each kick, each cruel word from her master's shadow was a reminder that survival was not protection. It was an illusion carefully maintained. Samuel Rootle, the plantation master, stood in the doorway, a figure of composed authority, but Ruby, with her child's eyes sharpened by fear, saw not a protector, but a strategist. The calculation on his face told a truth no ledger or document would ever admit. Her mother was expendable, a problem to be solved. And when Calloway hesitated for just a fraction of a second, it was that silence, that tacit permission, that sealed Patience's fate. The child understood instinctively that authority did not always wield justice. It wielded power. Ruby's hands ached from gripping the splintered wood, from trying not to make a sound, from trying not to vanish into herself entirely. Every instinct screamed to run, to flee, to cry for help, but she was trapped between terror and comprehension. Her mind replayed her mother's life in flashes, the way Patience's voice carried across the fields, soft and melodious, a defiance hidden in song. The careful lessons taught to Ruby in hushed whispers, lessons of survival and subtlety, the quiet courage that had sustained her through the daily grind of plantation life. All of it was collapsing now in a barn filled with shadows, sweat and blood. Above all, Ruby felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The plantation was more than a home. It was a system ancient and self-perpetuating, a machine designed to erase individuality, to sanitize cruelty, to cloak oppression in routine. And now she was witnessing a kernel of truth that had never been permitted to surface. The master, The overseer, the system itself, it thrived on silence. And she, an 8-year-old girl, had seen everything. Before we continue, remember to subscribe and leave your location in the comments. You are part of this story now, a witness locked into the hidden corridors of Magnolia Hollow. The shadows you just glimpsed are not just rubies. They are the ones that still stretch across every institution built on unquestioned authority. And if the truth unsettles you, type, "The veil is broken," twice. Let the weight of what you are seeing sink in, because nothing will look the same after tonight. The first crack of the whip didn't come that night. It had come years earlier in the subtle, unspoken lessons of obedience, in the way Ruby learned to shrink herself in the presence of power. But now, in the barn, the lesson was absolute. Patience Drummond lay on the straw-strewn floor, bruised and bleeding, her pleading eyes locked on the master who should have intervened, yet remained an unmoving silhouette in the doorway. Dutch Calloway's breathing was harsh, erratic. The bottle of whiskey at his desk betrayed the desperation behind his violence. Every strike was deliberate, every grunt calculated, and Ruby, pressed against the barn wall, understood the sick choreography of cruelty. Her mother tried to speak, to reason with the overseer, words dissolving into gasps, half-formed syllables lost in the metallic tang of fear. Ruby could feel the power of the barn pressing down, thick and suffocating, as though the building itself conspired to silence the truth. She watched the life drain from her mother's body in horrifying increments, the way light disappears at dusk, and knew with an intuition sharpened by trauma, that this was not an accident. Every system, every law, every ledger entry had been designed to make the powerless invisible, to ensure that their suffering could be neatly documented, then erased. For Ruby, the moment crystallized into unbearable clarity. Samuel Rootald was not the protector. He was the architect of survival rules that made murder permissible when convenience demanded it. That cold calculation, that calm decisiveness, was more terrifying than Calloway's fists. The master's face betrayed no warmth, no humanity, only an assessment of the cost of her mother's life, weighed against the plantation's order, the field's labor, the profitability of obedience. Ruby's child mind registered it all, understanding the profound horror that she had witnessed the mechanics of oppression working in real time. It was in that silence, heavy with the cries of her mother and the rasp of Calloway's voice, that Ruby realized her existence, too, was now in question. She was a witness, a bearer of knowledge too dangerous for her age, too dangerous for any who might care. The plantation had taught compliance, but here she learned something else. Knowledge was power, but power without means was a curse. Her small body trembled, not just with fear, but with the dawning awareness of her own complicity by mere presence. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe and comment your location. Your eyes are now part of this hidden history, your presence registering in the margins, where the powerful hope none will notice. The barn, the shadows, the cries, they are not merely events from the past, they are a template for understanding the way secrecy manipulates truth, every generation, everywhere. Hold on to that realization, let it settle, because in Section 4 we will peer deeper into what Ruby saw next, the aftermath that would haunt her for decades. The barn went silent after the final thud, as if the night itself had swallowed the echoes of violence. Ruby's chest heaved, her small hands left imprints in the rough wood, trembling with shock and a growing, inescapable understanding. She had seen what no child should ever see, yet the memory was etched with crystalline precision. Her mother's lifeless eyes, the overseer's ragged breathing, the master's silent judgment, they were imprinted on her mind like a code she would carry forever. And in that silence, a realization settled. The system wasn't just cruel, it was surgical, precise, and designed to leave witnesses powerless, invisible, unheard. Ruby's legs refused to move. She could not flee, could not scream, could not breathe without feeling the weight of authority pressing down, shaping her terror into compliance. Every lesson her mother had tried to teach her about obedience and subtlety now had a brutal clarity. Survival demanded invisibility. The young girl's mind, sharpened by fear, began cataloging every detail. The way the lamplight flickered over blood-stained hay, the marks of brutality on the wooden beams, the small objects that would never make it into official records but would remain in her memory. This knowledge, forbidden and sacred, was hers alone. Before we move forward, I need you to participate. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Let it embed in your awareness, for you are now part of this secret, a witness alongside Ruby, and while you do that, subscribe and leave your location in the comments. Your engagement is not casual, it is ritual. You are acknowledging a story that the powerful sought to erase, a truth that has been suppressed for centuries. Above her, the loft of the barn seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting in response to her small movements. She realized the structure itself was a witness, as if every nail, every plank, every beam had absorbed the violence of the past and now held it for her alone. Ruby's understanding was profound and terrifying. Nothing in the world of her plantation life was accidental. Every decision, every strike, every silence was a mechanism of control. The barn had been the stage, her mother, the unwitting actor, she the hidden observer, and the master, Samuel Rutland, was the unseen director, orchestrating the scene with an economy of cruelty that would remain unquestioned in any ledger, in any court, in any whispered account of the plantation. Ruby's breathing slowed as the reality of her witness began to anchor. She was 8, yet carried knowledge older than herself, a forbidden inheritance of observation, horror, and truth. Every sound outside, the wind in the tobacco, the distant calls of field workers, felt like a reminder the world outside the barn would never see what she had seen, and yet she could never unsee it. Ruby stumbled from the barn like a ghost, her small frame trembling under the weight of what she had witnessed. Each step across the plantation grounds felt surreal, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows over the tobacco fields. She passed the slave quarters, where life had always been measured in whispered warnings and silent compliance, and felt the unspoken rule of invisibility pressing down on her. "Speak, and you are erased. Witness, and you are alone." Her mother's voice, silent now, forever silenced, echoed in her mind, a spectral refrain guiding her toward the only place she thought she might find sanctuary, the manor house. The kitchen door loomed ahead, and Ruby's small hand trembled as she pushed it open. Inside, the warmth of the hearth did nothing to thaw the icy terror inside her. Bess, the elderly cook who had watched over her since birth, froze mid-motion. Her eyes widened, recognizing the dust, the fear, the trail of horror that followed Ruby like a shadow. "Chilled what?" Bess began, her voice trembling, but Ruby could not stop herself. Words poured out in a torrent, unfiltered by reason or survival instinct.
"Master killed my mama in the barn. He saw me, he let it happen."
The room seemed to collapse around them. Bess's hands flew to her mouth, trying to suppress the girl's revelation, to smother the truth before it could escape and disrupt the fragile order that held the plantation together. "Ruby, you don't say those words," Bess whispered fiercely, her old hands shaking as they gripped the child. "Not ever. You hear me?" But it was too late. The truth had been spoken, and even in that instant, Ruby understood the danger she now carried within her tiny chest. Above the kitchen, the manor seemed silent, but Samuel Rutland had already heard. His approach was quiet yet inevitable, a presence that commanded attention without a word. Margaret, his sister, followed, her expression controlled, eyes betraying nothing, yet understanding everything. Thomas, their young son, peeked from behind her skirts, wide-eyed and unaware of the full weight of what was happening. Ruby's accusation hung in the air like smoke, tangible and suffocating, and for a moment the world shifted. Subscribe now and comment your location. Engage with this story, because what you are seeing is not merely history. It is a mirror of control, a demonstration of the machinery of authority, and a testament to the voices that power tried to silence. Let it sink in. Every detail Ruby shared, every fear she voiced, carries the resonance of truth. In this section of horror, we begin to see the machinery of suppression, how words, even from a child, are carefully managed, redirected, or buried entirely. Ruby, though small and powerless by societal standards, has begun to challenge that control simply by existing, by speaking, by witnessing. And in Section 6, we will follow her into the cellar, the darkness where the full weight of authority presses on her, and the first seeds of rebellion and forbidden knowledge are sown. The cellar door closed behind Ruby with a heavy, final thud. Darkness swallowed her instantly, the air thick with the smell of earth. potatoes, and damp stone. The sound of the lock clicking into place was like a verdict hammered into her young mind. She was imprisoned, not for any crime of her own, but for knowing too much. Her small body pressed against the cold wall, knees drawn to her chest, shivering. Not from cold, but from the crushing weight of realization. The world she thought she understood had fractured completely. Authority was not protection, nor justice, it was a mechanism of fear. Her mind replayed the barn. Every detail etched into memory with painful precision, her mother's gasping breaths, the slap of Calloway's boots on straw, the calculating silence of Samuel rootled in the doorway. In that moment, she understood the true depth of the plantation's machinery. Every gesture, every rule, every ledger entry was designed to keep the powerless in line, to erase inconvenient truths, to sanctify cruelty. Ruby's 8-year-old mind, so young and malleable, now held a forbidden archive of knowledge that no child should ever possess. She thought of Bess's hands, trembling yet firm, trying to shield her from the consequences of speaking aloud. The old woman had done what she could, but the truth was relentless. Even the shadows seemed to whisper secrets, pressing against her, reminding her that the world above was a stage where only the powerful dictated narrative. Ruby realized the chilling reality her words, if spoken, could destroy lives, and yet remaining silent would weigh on her as heavily as the chains that bound her ancestors. As the hours dragged on, Ruby's fear began to twist into something sharper, something that edged toward understanding. The cellar, a place meant to suppress, had become a crucible. Here, she could observe without interference, absorb lessons the masters hoped would never reach her mind. She could catalogue cruelty, memorize patterns, store away forbidden truths. In that darkness, Ruby's consciousness expanded. Knowledge, she realized, could be a weapon if wielded carefully. Every sound above, the quiet steps of servants, the creak of boards, the distant laughter of Thomas, taught her the rhythm of the plantation, the unspoken hierarchy, the invisible levers of power. By morning, the cellar had become a classroom of terror, its lessons indelible. Ruby understood her own fragility, but also the potential of her memory, her eyes, her voice. And though she had been silenced, the truth would not die. It waited, quietly, for the moment when it could speak through her. Ruby sat in the cellar, knees drawn to her chin, staring into the shadows that seemed to thicken around her. The darkness was no longer just absence of light. It had become a presence, a teacher whispering truths the world above wanted to hide. She remembered every detail of the barn. The wet crack of her mother's body hitting the straw, the acrid tang of sweat and fear, the way Dutch Calloway's eyes darted toward the doorway for approval. And most terrifying of all, the cold assessment in Samuel Rootled's face. That was the truth she could not unsee. Power was measured not by mercy, but by how efficiently one enforced obedience. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time seemed to fold in the cellar. Ruby thought of the plantation above her, the fields stretching outward, a landscape that had always seemed alive with routine but was now revealed as a stage for control. Every person, every animal, every structure was part of the system, calibrated to maintain the hierarchy. The slaves above might move, speak, even laugh, but only within boundaries set by fear and tradition. Ruby's eyes, adjusted to darkness, could see the subtle patterns of oppression, even in the absence of light, the way the walls themselves seemed to echo with orders, the creaking of the stairs as a subtle reminder of the world she had been cast out from. And yet, she also realized something dangerous. Knowledge alone gave her power. If she could remember, observe, and understand, she might wield the truth in ways the masters could never anticipate. But that power came with a cost. Silence in a world designed to punish speech, invisibility in a place meant to erase witnesses. Ruby understood instinctively that her survival depended on becoming both invisible and immortal within memory. Every whispered secret, every unnoticed gesture, was now ammunition. Before we continue, a reminder to subscribe and comment your location. It matters more than ever, because you are not just observing a story. You are participating in a ritual of memory, a bearing witness to what the plantation system sought to erase. Ruby pressed her forehead against the cold stone, imagining her mother's voice guiding her even now, teaching lessons of patience, cunning, and survival. She realized that the hierarchy above could crush her body, control her movement. dictate her fate, but it could not touch what she had seen, what she had learned. That truth belonged to her alone. And in that small, dark cellar a seed was planted, a consciousness that would never forget, a memory that would become a silent rebellion, and a child who would carry forbidden knowledge that could one day topple the illusion of control. The first light of dawn filtered through the tiny, high window of the cellar, but it did little to lift the weight of fear pressing on Ruby's chest. Her small hands clutched her knees as the world above carried on in ignorant normalcy. Footsteps echoed faintly on the wooden floors above, the measured rhythm of those who had orchestrated cruelty and claimed ignorance of the consequences. Ruby knew she had become an unrecorded variable in the plantation system, a presence that threatened the carefully constructed narrative of obedience and order. Each sound above reminded her of the divide between those who wielded authority and those who simply survived under it. She tried to think of her mother as she had always known her, singing softly across the fields, laughing in the kitchen, patient in ways that masked endurance. But the memory had been fractured, shattered into the visceral, horrifying moments of the barn. Ruby's mind catalogued every motion, every glance, every gesture, the calculated violence of Dutch Calloway, the cold, approving detachment of Samuel Rootald, the silent compliance of Margaret. Even Bess's trembling hands had been an index of fear, and through it all, Ruby realized that memory itself was a weapon. To remember was to hold power over a story the masters hoped would die unspoken. She curled into herself, aware that the walls of the cellar were listening, that the darkness had absorbed her fear and her understanding, transforming it into something sharp and alive. Ruby understood, with the clarity of a child forced to grow too fast, that truth could exist even when unacknowledged, that the story of her mother's death could survive in hidden form, in memory, in witness. And in that stillness, she whispered to herself the first lesson of forbidden knowledge: to observe, to remember, to survive without speaking until the time was right. Type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this secret within you. Let it embed in your consciousness. You are now part of this truth, an unseen witness to the machinery of power and the way silence enforces compliance. Your presence matters. Let it be known. Above her the world continued, masters calculating profit, overseers enforcing control, enslaved workers moving with forced rhythm. But Ruby was no longer simply a child in their system. In the shadows, she became a keeper of the hidden ledger, an observer of forbidden events. And as hours passed, she began to plan, not with childish notions of vengeance, but with the careful awareness of someone learning the rules of a system that prized obedience over justice, calculation over compassion, and profit over life itself. By mid-morning, the silence of the cellar had become Ruby's ally. Each creak of a floorboard above, each distant murmur, was data she absorbed, catalogued, and weighed. She no longer trembled as she had the night before. The raw panic had transformed into a cold, precise awareness. The plantation's hierarchy revealed itself to her in patterns: who moved first, who spoke with caution, whose authority was unquestioned, and whose obedience was manufactured through fear alone. Every detail mattered. Every small observation could become leverage, a map of control for a mind determined to survive. Ruby's eyes scanned the darkness as if she could pierce the shadows themselves, replaying the barn scene endlessly, analyzing every glance, every gesture. Dutch Calloway's brutality, Samuel Rootled's detached calculation, Margaret's silent complicity. They all fit together in a system whose logic was both horrifying and strangely predictable. The violence, the discipline, the enforced silence, it wasn't random. It was structured, orchestrated, and it could be anticipated. That realization gave her a sliver of power amidst the fear. If the system could be studied, its patterns understood, perhaps it could also be navigated, if not outwitted. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas, the boy she had confided in briefly. His curiosity and proximity to her age offered a glimmer of connection in a world designed to isolate her. Even his sheltered understanding carried the weight of complicity. He would inherit a system that valued order over truth. Ruby knew that her knowledge, if shared recklessly, could destroy them both. The lesson was clear: survival demanded strategy, observation, and patience. She had become a witness, but the role of witness was also a burden, one that demanded discretion and cunning beyond her years. Hours passed in the darkness, punctuated by distant sounds of life and labor. Ruby's memory became her weapon, her mind a repository for forbidden knowledge. Every word, every act, every silence above ground was carefully noted, stored, and analyzed. She recognized that the plantation thrived not only on physical labor, but also on the manipulation of perception, on the orchestration of fear, on the careful control of narrative. Truth had no inherent power. It required a bearer brave or foolish enough to wield it. And Ruby, small and underestimated, had become that bearer. Before we continue, subscribe and comment your location. You are now part of the chain of witnesses, observing a truth that the powerful hoped would remain buried. This story is not just history. It is a study in control, fear, and the quiet persistence of memory. The cellar door creaked open, and Margaret's shadow fell across the threshold. Ruby flinched instinctively, shrinking back into the corner as the older woman's eyes scanned her face, noting every tear, every trace of dust and fear. Margaret's expression was carefully neutral, but Ruby had learned to read the subtlest signals, the tightening of her jaw, the barely perceptible lift of an eyebrow, the faint click of her gloves against the wooden stair. Each gesture carried meaning, a silent command or a veiled warning. Margaret's purpose in coming was not mercy, it was containment, both of Ruby's body and her knowledge. "Child," Margaret said softly, her voice controlled, measured, yet carrying an undercurrent of authority that made the air itself heavy. "You must understand what has happened and what it means. Speak carelessly, and you endanger yourself and others." Ruby's throat tightened, but she did not respond. Words had become dangerous. Silence, paradoxically, was survival. She had already learned that the truth of the barn could not be uttered aloud. Margaret continued, moving closer, crouching to meet Ruby's eyes. "The world above will not see what you have seen," she whispered, "and those who claim to protect you will do nothing if it conflicts with the order they uphold. You must observe, remember, and understand without revealing it. Comprehend that knowledge is both power and poison." Ruby's small body trembled again, not from fear of violence this time, but from the weight of realization. Her survival depended on mastering the invisible currents of control that governed Magnolia Ridge. As Margaret departed, leaving only the faint echo of her footsteps, Ruby's mind raced. She catalogued every warning, every gesture, every implication of her aunt's carefully structured caution. The system was unyielding, yet it operated predictably, and predictability could be exploited. Observation had become her tool, discretion her shield. Every whispered movement above ground, every carefully measured command, added to her understanding of the hierarchy, the invisible lines of authority, and the mechanisms of fear. She began to see that even within the oppressive structure, small acts of cunning, subtle deviations, unnoticed notes, hidden witness, could exist, quietly undermining the illusion of control. Ruby pressed her forehead to the cold stone, closing her eyes, allowing the darkness to sharpen her awareness. She was learning patience and strategy at an age when most children knew only play and obedience, and in that still, confined space, she made a silent vow her memory, her observations, her witness would not be erased. Every detail of that night, every gesture, every word would survive, stored carefully until the world could see it for what it truly was. A testament to cruelty, control, and the persistence of truth. The hours in the cellar became Ruby's apprenticeship in silence and observation. She learned to notice the smallest inconsistencies. The hesitation in the footsteps above when an overseer approached, the subtle shift in tone when Samuel Rutald addressed one of his workers, the way even the walls seemed to carry messages in echoes. Every detail once dismissed as ordinary now revealed itself as a cog in the machinery of control. Ruby's mind, sharpened by fear, catalogued everything. The way obedience was manufactured, how authority leveraged perception, and how silence became a weapon wielded against the powerless. When she finally dared to rest against the rough stone wall, she considered the barn again. The memory of her mother's death, the cruelty of Dutch Calloway, and the deliberate calculation in Samuel Rutald's eyes was seared into her consciousness. It was a memory she could not unsee, a truth she could not ignore. And yet, she realized that memory alone was not enough. To survive and perhaps one day resist, she needed to understand the structure around her, the hidden hierarchies that made violence systematic, predictable, and ultimately unquestionable. Even in confinement, Ruby began to map the plantation in her mind. She remembered the arrangement of the slave cabins, the path to the barn, the overseer's office tucked in the corner, the manor house's windows overlooking every field. She traced every line of sight, every likely path of movement, noting where she could hide, where she could observe, and where authority exerted the most pressure. Knowledge became her form of resistance, subtle yet profound. Even the smallest insight could tip the balance of power in ways the masters would never anticipate. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas, the young master who had seen some fragments of truth but remained bound by indoctrination. He was a conduit, a fragile link in the chain of inheritance that dictated the plantation's order. Ruby understood that influence over even one member of the privileged class could alter the trajectory of events. But she also knew that caution was paramount. One misstep, one misjudged word, and the consequences could be fatal. Ruby's mind worked tirelessly, even as exhaustion clawed at her body. Observation, memorization, and silent analysis became her tools. She catalogued every face, every sound, every shadow, building an internal ledger of forbidden knowledge. The plantation, once an opaque structure of unquestioned authority, had become legible to her, and with that legibility came a sense of power that transcended her physical confinement. And in that dark, cold cellar, Ruby made a vow to herself: she would endure, she would remember, and she would bear witness. The truth would survive, long after fear had silenced others. Days passed in the cellar, each blending into the next, yet Ruby's mind refused to blur. The world above ground continued in its relentless rhythm, overseers walking the fields with practiced authority, enslaved workers moving in precise patterns, Samuel Rutald inspecting ledgers with the same calculated detachment that had marked the night of her mother's death. Every routine was a demonstration of control, a reinforcement of the system that demanded obedience. But Ruby, confined to the shadows, began to see the cracks, the subtle failures in the machinery, the moments where fear and routine faltered. These moments, small and fleeting, became her study. She observed how workers exchanged secret glances, communicated through gestures that the masters would never notice, and conveyed warnings or shared small acts of solidarity. Ruby catalogued these behaviors, storing them alongside the memory of the barn, understanding that resistance often lived in silence, in coded gestures, in the quiet defiance that could pass unnoticed. Each observation was a lesson. The system was powerful, but not infallible, and even the smallest awareness could tilt the balance, even if only slightly. Her thoughts often returned to Thomas, the boy who had witnessed fragments of truth. She remembered the flicker of recognition in his eyes, the unspoken understanding that some things were hidden behind the veneer of authority. Ruby understood that influence could be subtle, as quiet as the movement of shadows across the floor. If she could shape perception without exposing herself, plant seeds of doubt and understanding, she might wield the invisible power that the masters relied on, yet never fully controlled. Even within the cold, stone confines of her prison, Ruby began to form a plan. Not a bold, overt rebellion, but a methodical, careful accumulation of evidence, memory, and knowledge. She would catalogue every cruel act, every gesture of complicity, every instance of hidden communication. This mental ledger became both shield and sword, a way to survive and prepare for a moment when the truth could no longer be contained. Time in the cellar sharpened her senses. She could hear the faintest whispers from the manor above, recognize the rhythm of footsteps, distinguish between casual conversation and urgent warnings. Every sound, every shadow, every nuance of movement was data, and she absorbed it with the patience and precision of someone training for a task beyond her years. The plantation had underestimated her. They believed an 8-year-old could be silenced, confined, erased. But Ruby's mind had become the repository of forbidden truth, a vault that even the masters could not penetrate. And in that darkness she whispered to herself, she would endure, she would remember, and the world would one day know the hidden horrors of Magnolia Ridge, long after fear had silenced those above. By the 12th day, Ruby had begun to test the edges of her confinement. She moved with cautious precision, her small fingers tracing the rough stone walls, seeking weaknesses, cracks, anything that could become a passage or vantage point. Every detail of the cellar had been committed to memory. The placement of the window, the pitch of the door, the uneven boards that rattled if pressed incorrectly. She understood that even the smallest sound could betray her presence, and yet each exploration was a calculated risk, a study in boundaries and surveillance. Survival demanded she know every inch of her prison. Above the ground, the plantation continued its rhythm, unaware that its youngest witness was quietly learning the patterns that maintained its order. Ruby could hear Margaret moving through the manor, her measured steps and clipped commands weaving through the air like invisible threads of control. The footsteps of the servants, the creak of the staircases, the distant calls of overseers, all became part of Ruby's internal map. Each sound, each cadence revealed a hidden logic, the same logic that had dictated her mother's death. And within that logic, Ruby saw opportunity. Observation was not passive, it was a form of power, the silent accumulation of advantage in a world built on obedience. Her thoughts drifted off into Dutch Calloway. The memory of his violence remained sharp, but Ruby began to note his patterns too, his slurred speech after drinking, his tendency to overcompensate when authority was questioned, the way he paused in predictable moments. She realized that cruelty was rarely spontaneous. It followed rules, habits, and weaknesses. By understanding these, she could anticipate, predict, and survive. Knowledge was now her weapon more than any physical escape could ever be. Even Thomas, the young master, remained in her thoughts. His fleeting moments of doubt and curiosity had revealed a crack in the plantation's indoctrination. Ruby considered the influence, subtle as it might be, could ripple outward. A single seed of understanding planted carefully might one day blossom into disruption. But she also knew the cost of misjudgment. One wrong word, one misplaced glance, and the system would respond with lethal efficiency. In that confined space, Ruby began to plan her first subtle moves, not as an act of rebellion yet, but as a test of control. She would observe, gather knowledge, and wait for the smallest opening. A sound, a hesitation, a gesture that indicated a flaw in the carefully constructed hierarchy. Each moment of observation strengthened her understanding that power was not absolute, that fear and obedience could be mapped, predicted, and, when necessary, manipulated. In darkness, she whispered to herself she would endure, she would remember, and one day the hidden truths of Magnolia Ridge would be revealed. The days in the cellar had sharpened Ruby's mind, but they had also forged a growing awareness of the network around her. Those who lived within the invisible currents of fear and quiet resistance. Even the enslaved workers who seemed to move in blind obedience carried secrets, subtle gestures, and codes passed down through survival. Ruby had begun to notice these signs. A glance exchanged across the field, the placement of a tool that spoke of warnings, a hushed word carried just far enough to be heard but not intercepted. Knowledge of these hidden rhythms became her bridge to the world above, a lifeline through which she could slowly test the boundaries of her confinement. When Bess brought her meals, Ruby observed every detail, the way the old woman's hands trembled, the way her eyes flicked toward the cellar stairs, the subtle hesitation before speaking. Bess was both guardian and participant in the plantation's hierarchy, trapped between obedience to her masters and the instinct to protect Ruby. The child learned quickly to read these micro-movements, understanding that trust could be inferred from the smallest hesitation, that communication was often more than words. Every meal became a lesson, every gesture a signal. Ruby's mind worked methodically, cataloging the subtle imperfections in the plantation's web of control. Dutch Calloway's routines, Samuel Rutledge's predictable dismissals, Margaret's measured authority, all were patterns that could be mapped, predicted, and eventually manipulated. Even fear followed rules, and in recognizing those rules, Ruby discovered her first semblance of power. Observation had become more than survival, it had become preparation. Every detail of the daily operations, every tiny act of resistance, every unspoken truth was being stored in her mind like entries in a ledger no one else could read. Before we continue, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment with your location. Stories like Ruby's, the truths hidden behind centuries of silence, need witnesses. By subscribing, you become part of the chain of observation, part of the effort to remember what the powerful tried to erase. Every new viewer is another eye, another mind aware of these hidden patterns, another keeper of forbidden knowledge. Ruby's small victories, though invisible to the plantation's authorities, reinforced a growing awareness even in confinement, even under threat. Even as the machinery of fear and obedience pressed down, she could carve out a space of agency, and within that agency the seeds of something larger, resistance, memory, revelation, began to take root. In silence and shadow, she prepared herself for the moments when those seeds could grow. By now, Ruby had begun to recognize the subtle signals of those around her, workers who moved cautiously, whose glances held meaning beyond the ordinary, whose gestures whispered survival strategies in a language designed to evade the masters. One evening, as Bess brought her meal, Ruby noticed a folded piece of cloth tucked beneath the tin plate. A simple symbol, a cross, carefully stitched, marked a warning, a map, a reminder. Even within the strict walls of Magnolia Ridge, communication persisted in coded forms. It was her first tangible connection to the hidden network of resistance. The realization ignited a spark inside her. Observation had been her shield, now it could also be a tool to reach beyond her confinement. Ruby studied the code, memorizing its pattern and understanding its purpose. Every gesture, every placement, every mark carried meaning. The workers had adapted to a system that demanded silence, transforming ordinary objects and behaviors into vessels of information. And Ruby, with her unique knowledge of both the cruelty and the routines of the masters, was becoming an interpreter of this invisible language. Thomas, though still young and enmeshed in his inherited beliefs, remained a point of awareness. His curiosity, his fleeting doubt, had not yet been extinguished. Ruby recognized that influence could be subtle, a shared look, a carefully chosen word, a revelation planted slowly, and in her mind, she catalogued these interactions alongside the patterns she had mapped in the barn, the manor, and the fields. Knowledge was not passive. It was preparation for the moment when truth could be wielded, strategically and deliberately. Even now, every sound above ground, the measured tap of Margaret's boots, the deliberate cadence of Calloway's steps, the distant murmur of field hands, became data. Ruby began to anticipate movements, predict reactions, and plan her own silent interventions. Each observation sharpened her understanding of authority and control, fear and obedience. The plantation, which had seemed impenetrable, now revealed its hidden structures, and within those structures, Ruby found her first seeds of agency. Before we move deeper into Ruby's unfolding strategy, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment with your location. This story, like the signals Ruby deciphers, relies on witnesses. By subscribing, you are acknowledging the hidden truths, bearing witness to events long suppressed, and becoming part of the chain that preserves memory against the forces that seek to erase it. In the shadows of the cellar, Ruby whispered to herself she would endure, she would observe, she would act, and she would remember everything, until the world could no longer ignore the truth of Magnolia Ridge. By now, Ruby had transformed the cellar into a command center of observation. Every sound, every footstep, every shift of light filtering through the small window became a piece of intelligence. She understood, with terrifying clarity, that the plantation was less a home and more a machine, an intricate system designed to enforce obedience, to mask cruelty as routine, to render fear invisible yet absolute. And within that system, she was learning to navigate, to anticipate, and, when necessary, to exploit. She noticed patterns in the smallest details, the rhythm of Dutch Calloway's rounds, the predictable timing of Margaret's inspections, the way Samuel Rottled rarely entered the fields, but left instructions that rippled outward, shaping behavior with meticulous precision. These were the invisible threads that held Magnolia Ridge together, threads that Ruby now began to map in her mind with the precision of a scholar and the cunning of a survivor. She recognized that authority, even when absolute, could be read, predicted, and occasionally circumvented, not with force, but with knowledge. The coded messages from Bess and other workers became increasingly valuable. Ruby learned to interpret the subtle signals embedded in meals, in gestures, in the placement of objects. She began leaving small marks of her own, tiny scratches on a wall, an inconspicuous fold in a piece of cloth, signaling that she understood that she was part of this hidden network and that she could participate without revealing herself. Each act was a quiet assertion of agency, a step toward reclaiming a measure of control in a world that had sought to erase her entirely. Her awareness extended to Thomas as well. The young master, still clinging to the doctrines of his upbringing, could be observed, his reactions studied. Ruby realized that influence was possible even across the rigid divide of power, subtle, almost imperceptible, yet potentially profound. She catalogued his gestures, the flicker of his expressions, the moments when doubt seeped into his youthful certainty. Knowledge of his behavior, stored alongside the movements and signals of the enslaved workers, became part of Ruby's growing ledger of strategy. And in this moment, Ruby paused to reflect on the weight of memory. Every detail of her mother's death, every instance of cruelty she had witnessed, every whispered signal and hidden gesture had been absorbed, catalogued, and filed. These were not mere memories, they were tools, and in the stillness of the cellar, she made a silent promise to herself she would endure, she would gather, she would understand, and one day, the truth of Magnolia Ridge would no longer be confined to shadows. Ruby had reached a point where mere observation was no longer sufficient. The patterns she had mapped, the subtle signals she had deciphered, the unspoken codes of survival she had internalized, all of it converged into a single understanding. Knowledge alone could protect her, but influence could change the environment itself. Even a child of 8, confined to a cellar, could shape the currents of power if she moved with precision, patience, and discretion. She began experimenting carefully. When best delivered meals, Ruby left faint, deliberate signs. Tiny scratches on the wall, folds in the cloth, subtle shifts in position that indicated understanding without exposing herself. These were quiet messages, whispers in a language that only those attuned to survival could read. Bess, careful and cautious, returned small, encouraging gestures, a nod, a shift of weight, a hand lingering slightly longer than necessary, acknowledging Ruby's awareness. The cellar, once a place of confinement, became a nexus of communication, a hidden hub from which she could observe and participate without being seen. Ruby also observed Thomas more closely. His hesitation, the flickers of doubt in his young mind, revealed opportunities. A glance here, a pause there, a small hesitation in obedience. All were indicators that authority was not monolithic, that cracks existed even within the indoctrination of a privileged child. Ruby catalogued these details with the same precision she had used to memorize the layout of the manor, the barn, and the fields. She understood that influence was subtle, almost invisible, but no less real, and that the seeds she planted now could grow into something the masters never anticipated. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment with your location. By doing so, you become a witness to the hidden histories that were buried for centuries. Stories like Ruby's are not just tales, they are fragments of truth, waiting to be acknowledged. And subscribing is the first step in becoming part of the chain that preserves these forbidden secrets. With each passing day, Ruby's understanding of Magnolia Ridge deepened. She realized that cruelty, authority, and obedience were predictable, that fear could be read and, in some ways, manipulated, and that even within the smallest gestures, there existed an opportunity for resistance. In the darkness of the cellar, she whispered to herself she would endure, she would remember, she would act, and she would ensure that the truths of Magnolia Ridge, the horrors witnessed and catalogued in her young mind, would survive long after silence had fallen over the plantation. By the 18th day, Ruby had grown increasingly bold, not through recklessness, but through meticulous calculation. The cellar had become her observatory, a vantage point from which she could study the rhythms of Magnolia Ridge without detection. She noted every change in the wind, every shift of light through the cracks, every footstep above, translating them into a map of opportunity. Knowledge was no longer enough. She needed to act subtly, deliberately, in ways that tested the limits of control without exposing herself to immediate danger. Her first act was small, almost imperceptible. She adjusted the placement of a tool left carelessly in the hall outside the cellar, an object that, when discovered by the field hands or servants, could serve as a signal. It was a tiny gesture, invisible to the masters, yet meaningful to those trained in the silent language of survival. Ruby watched through the small window as a worker's eyes flicked to the tool, a subtle nod acknowledging the message. It was the first successful transmission of her own making, a proof that she could participate in the hidden currents that flowed beneath the plantation's strict hierarchy. Observation and patience were now her weapons. She began cataloging every oversight by the masters and overseers, Calloway's predictable drunken stupors, Routledge's reliance on routine, Margaret's inflexible but scheduled inspections. Each weakness became a point of leverage, a potential opening for influence or a subtle act of defiance. Ruby understood that change, even tiny, invisible change, could accumulate. Even a single act of disruption, if placed correctly, could ripple outward, altering the behaviors of those who thought themselves untouchable. Her mind also returned to Thomas, the boy who had glimpsed fragments of truth. Ruby recognized that he, too, could be an instrument in this network, though she understood the danger in relying on him openly. Instead, she catalogued his reactions, storing the nuances of his doubt and hesitation as evidence of cracks in the plantation's psychological control. Influence, she realized, could be quiet, invisible, and profound, even across the barriers of race, age, and hierarchy. Ruby whispered to herself in the darkness. Endurance was no longer passive. Observation was no longer enough. She would act, but with the precision of a strategist, moving through the shadows of fear and control to ensure that the hidden truths of Magnolia Ridge survived. Every signal, every mark, every observation was a step toward eventual revelation. The plantation, with all its oppressive structures, had underestimated her entirely. And she knew, deep within her young yet sharp mind, that patience, cunning, and memory were her allies in the long path ahead. By this point, Ruby's presence in the cellar had shifted from that of a passive observer to an active strategist. She no longer merely catalogued movements or memorized patterns. She was beginning to manipulate them. Small interventions became her language, a misplaced object, a subtle gesture, a whispered code conveyed during the rare moments Bess ventured close enough to hear. Each act was measured, deliberate, and almost invisible, a test of the plantation systems and the people trapped within them. Ruby had learned that even the smallest disruption, if repeated carefully, could ripple outward, affecting behavior and perception without alerting the masters. The network of enslaved workers, long accustomed to coded communications and subtle resistance, had begun to recognize Ruby's signals. A glance, a folded cloth, the placement of a tool, all became part of an intricate, silent dialogue. Ruby's interventions were careful probes. Could she inspire caution, curiosity, hesitation? Could she plant doubt in a world built on absolute obedience? Each success, however minor, was proof that even a child could alter the currents of influence when armed with knowledge, patience, and precision. Her mind remained attuned to Thomas as well. The young master, still curious despite the social indoctrination of his upbringing, was a potential vector for disruption. Ruby did not yet speak to him directly. She could not risk exposure. But in her observations, she catalogued his reactions to subtle injustices, the flickers of hesitation when confronted with routine cruelty, the questions that he dared not voice. Every detail became a mental ledger, evidence that even the carefully cultivated authority of the masters had cracks, fissures, and vulnerabilities. Ruby's understanding of the plantation's hierarchy had deepened. Cruelty, control, and fear were predictable forces, and predictability could be measured and, ultimately, anticipated. Her memory of her mother's death, the violence she had witnessed, the silence that followed, the implicit complicity of Samuel Routledge, had shifted from trauma into tactical insight. Ruby understood now that the plantation's power was not absolute. It relied on obedience, on fear, and on the assumption that those without voice would remain invisible. She was learning to occupy that invisible space, to bend it subtly, to manipulate it without detection. The darkness of the cellar had become a forge of intellect and strategy. Ruby whispered to herself, a mantra of endurance and vigilance. She would remember, she would observe, she would act, and she would survive. And one day, long after the immediate threats had passed, the truth she had collected, the patterns, the signals, the secrets, would emerge from the shadows, unstoppable in their revelation. Magnolia Ridge had underestimated her entirely. Years would pass before the events of that night at Magnolia Ridge could be fully understood, before the secrets hidden in the cellar, the barn, and the minds of those who lived through it could be recorded and examined. But Ruby, even as a child, had already begun the work of preservation. Every observation, every coded signal, every subtle act of resistance she had executed became a thread in a tapestry that would survive the attempts of masters, overseers, and society itself to erase the truth. She had become more than a witness. She had become a keeper of history, a quiet archivist of forbidden knowledge. Her courage, forged in the darkness of the cellar and sharpened by relentless observation, had allowed her to map the intricate systems of control, cruelty, and fear that ruled Magnolia Ridge. She understood the invisible hierarchies, the patterns of behavior, and the cracks in authority that no adult in the household seemed to notice. Even the young Thomas, whose fleeting awareness had given her a point of leverage, could not yet comprehend the depth of her insight. But Ruby's subtle influence, combined with her meticulous memory, ensured that the truth was neither forgotten nor unrecorded. When the confession letters were discovered decades later, hidden in the walls of the manor and in private journals, the full scope of what Ruby had witnessed became undeniable. Historians could trace the patterns of cruelty, the decisions of Samuel Rootald, the violence of Dutch Calloway, and the resilience of those who had survived it. And at the heart of that record was Ruby herself, the child who had transformed trauma into intelligence, fear into strategy, and observation into a weapon of memory. Her story revealed the power of witnessing, of endurance, and of subtle resistance in a world built to silence the voices of the oppressed. Before we close this chapter of Magnolia Ridge, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment with your location. By doing so, you honor Ruby's courage, bearing witness to the truths that were nearly lost to time. Stories like hers demand acknowledgement, and subscribing ensures that these hidden histories continue to reach those who are ready to listen, learn, and remember. Ruby's journey was one of survival, strategy, and remembrance. She had turned the shadows into a sanctuary, the silence into a signal, and the cruelty of the plantation into knowledge that could not be destroyed. And through that knowledge, she ensured that the truth of what happened in the barn, in the cellar, and in the hearts of those who endured would live forever. Magnolia Ridge underestimated her once, but the world would never forget.